We are so blessed to have Rowan Williams in our midst, and I call on him now for his lecture. Rowan, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm conscious that you've been sitting for an hour, and you might be quite grateful to have a chance of standing up and stretching your arms for a moment. I'm all right, thanks. So if you're feeling reasonably restored by now, and if you feel that you might just be able to survive the next 20 minutes without falling asleep, for which I give you permission in any case, I'm happy to begin. Let me first of all say what I'd like to do in the next hour and in what I'm going to be sharing with you tomorrow morning. I've given to these two lectures titles that relate to the idea of seeding, seeds of violence, seeds of communion, on the assumption that one of the things we are doing when we preach is precisely sowing seeds. That's to say, we're turning over the shared ground on which we stand as believers, hoping that the words we speak as preachers and as teachers will make something possible, will germinate, and allow fruit to emerge in due course. Which is why the act of preaching is not one that brings instant results, except in very rare cases. Very rare indeed. And sometimes those immediate results are not quite what you hoped for, perhaps. I'm thinking of the legendary 17th century lady in St. Giles's Cathedral, Edinburgh, who threw a stool at the Anglican preacher when he attempted to introduce the Book of Common Prayer into the pure Presbyterian air of St. Giles's. No, what we do is to speak in such a way that we hope will open up a process of growing and indeed of learning. So in these two lectures, I want to reflect on the kinds of seeds we sow. And that prompts me to stand back a bit, to ask some questions about the whole of our practice of language and the seeds we sow day by day and the currency we pay out and the currency, therefore, in which we are paid back in our speaking. And framing all of that, which I hope will come into focus a bit more tomorrow, is my assumption, which I touched on very briefly last night in preaching, my assumption that the act of preaching is an act of and in the body of Christ, not the performance of one individual for the sake of others, but an activity of the body in which the body of Christ, the assembly of Christ's friends, learns how to speak so as to transfigure. Two years ago, we were commemorating another centenary, this time the centenary of the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. The most dramatic moment in the swelling pressure for an independent Ireland, but in itself a failed rebellion with some very tragic elements to it. Years later, the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats wrote in one of his most celebrated poems, Easter 1916, of his own ambiguous recollection of the era that led up to the Dublin Rising. He had been involved in nationalist rhetoric and politics and advocacy in those years, and he wrote in his later poem, "Did those words of mine send out certain men the English shot?" In other words, Yeats was asking himself, did he help to drive people to what seemed at the time pointless, tragic death? To look back on the words that once spoken and to ask, were those words poisonous, lethal, and diminishing, is a sobering enterprise for any writer, poet, preacher, philosopher, theologian. You can look at the whole spectrum of human intellectual creativity and see again and again how words turn out to sow seeds which may be very far from the intention of an original speaker, and yet have all that power and energy which seeds possess when they fall into fertile soil. At the very least, we need to have an awareness of what kind of soil a seed is falling into. So that, for example, when the philosopher Heidegger in the 1930s, in his infamous Rektoratsrede at the university, when he'd become rector of his university thanks to the National Socialist government, when he delivered a speech praising Adolf Hitler, praising the new order and vision and moral cohesion given to Germany by Hitler's rule, he was sowing seeds in a very fertile soil indeed. Seeds which would eventually come up in the form of genocidal violence, slaughter, and disgrace. Heidegger's complex silence in his later life, constantly evading that moment of responsibility, is one of the most difficult things that historians of modern philosophy have to confront and make sense of, because he refused to, unlike Yeats. I hadn't expected to have quite such a contemporary instance, but last week in DC, I spent a little time with a man named Rob Schenck, S-C-H-E-N-K, who has just published this book, Costly Grace. It's subtitled An Evangelical Minister's Rediscovery of Faith, Hope, and Love. Rob was somebody who, having converted as a teenager from Judaism to Christianity, identified himself increasingly with the militant, politicized evangelicalism of the religious right in the United States. He was very active in campaigns of protest outside abortion clinics. And he describes in this book the sophisticated maneuvers and manipulations which he and his colleagues engaged in that campaign. He found himself drawn closer and closer to seats of power in Washington, having more and more access to government. And he says in the book that in George W. Bush's time, he felt that he and his colleagues had truly captured the citadel of American politics. But already by that time, he was beginning to deal with corrosive doubt and uncertainty about what he had done. And that doubt and uncertainty began with the first occasion when a doctor who performed abortions was murdered on October the 23rd, 1998, in a suburb of Buffalo. Rob Schenck describes his immediate reaction. I flew directly to Buffalo, and 20,000 feet above the usual distractions and demands, I started asking myself the hard questions. Who in our world would ever perpetrate such a horrible act? Was it possible someone under my spiritual care was an assassin? Our people put themselves in harm's way to prevent murder. How could one of them commit one? Had I ever said or done anything that contributed to this terrible event? Could I have prevented it? For Paul, that's his brother, and me, and so many of the activists around us, abortionists were not real people, but had become symbols of the worst of liberal and secularist ideals, manifestations of a selfish and materialistic culture. But as I look back on how my life had intersected with Dr. Slepian's, remembering our encounters and even our exchanges, I had a sense of understanding him. He was not just the embodiment of work I found abhorrent, but indeed was a real human being who had been murdered by someone who claimed to be one of us. The implications were too terrible for me to fully absorb. As the plane made its familiar descent into Buffalo, my more meaningful reflections were cut short when my old defensive reflexes sprang to action. I had a job to do, and that was to control the narrative. In the chapters that follow, Rob describes how that experience and that memory returned to haunt him. How further cases of murder at abortion clinics led him to question not his moral position on abortion, but his complicity with a culture all too ready to reach for the violent shortcut. And that was part of what finally led him out of the particular political network and set of allegiances he had adopted. The final breaking point came for him over the issue of gun control after a particularly hideous massacre, when he found himself speaking to a brick wall with many of his fellow evangelicals who could not understand why an evangelical should question gun culture. And so here he is as an evangelical minister still to this day, asking what it might mean to acknowledge complicity in language that seeds violence, and how we have to recover faith, hope, love, and the language of faith, hope, and love. How we recognize, name, and turn away from the seeds of violence. As I say, I hadn't expected to have so immediate and fresh an instance to discuss. But in a way, all that I say this afternoon is said far more effectively in this book, which I recommend very strongly to you. But it's also been said, if a little differently, long ago. Friends, not many of you should become teachers. You may be certain that we who teach will ourselves face a more severe judgment. All of us go wrong repeatedly. A person who never says anything wrong is perfect and is capable of controlling every part of their body. When we put a bit into a horse's mouth to make it obey our will, we're able to direct the whole animal. Or think of a ship. It may be very large and driven around by gales, but you can steer it by a very small rudder on whatever course the helmsman chooses. And so it is with the tongue. It is small, but its capacities are great. What a vast amount of wood can be set ablaze by the tiniest spark. And so in the 3rd chapter of St. James's letter, the tongue is analyzed by the apostle with relentless clarity. It doesn't take a great deal to make a conflagration. And those of us who live by the tongue, in some ways, perhaps ought to have a health warning around us. Flammable material. James goes on to say that there is something very peculiar about the human use of language, about the tongue. The rest of creation, it seems, doesn't quite have this problem. It does what it does. It speaks what it speaks. In the wonderful words of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, creation speaks what in God's sight it is. But we are able to speak in such a way as either to give life or to give death. What we say generates either living or dying, generates life-giving challenge or death-dealing hatred. Did those words of mine send out certain men the English shot? Did we say anything that made that possible? And that's why some of Patricia's remarks, especially at the end of her wonderful presentation this afternoon, will raise the same sorts of questions. And I wonder whether, in some unimaginable heaven, even the apostles and evangelists ask, did some words of mine send out ... So, what are the seeds of violence, and what kinds of speech generate death rather than life? I spoke a little last night about the way in which a Christian understanding of our speech, of our words, assumes that language is given us by God so that we build relation. And we assume that as Christians because we know that God's primordial utterance, God's literally outering, God's putting God's self out there, the word of creation, is supremely a word that gives life. And those of, for example, the Greek fathers who write about God's word in creation will say that the way in which we name things and relate to things in this world is always going to be rooted in that one logos, that one divine act of communicating and sharing. And when we are in tune with that one great divine act of communicating, we are free to see and to relate to the things of this world as they are, not as we fantasize them to be, not as they suit us or serve us. A wonderful passage in a 4th century Greek Christian writer who says that we have to learn to distinguish between diabolical ways of knowing the world and angelic ways of knowing it. The diabolical way of knowing the world is to speak of the world and to relate to the world as an object serving my passions. And the angelic speech and knowledge is to see the world for what it is and be in tune with that. Well, there's a whole lecture in that at least. But you'll see the point. The strangeness of our speaking is that we are able to seed those different outcomes, but to learn how to speak life-givingly, not only from the pulpit, but as a church, we need a bit of analysis of what it is that makes speech violent. And so I want to share with you a few examples of some of the things which I believe make speech potentially or actually violent, distort speech from its God-given character. Mindful of what St. James says in his letter, we, of course, can't but recognize that we will get this wrong repeatedly. And what distinguishes us as Christians is not that we are perfect, capable of controlling every part of our body, but that we are given the grace of seeing ourselves honestly and clearly when our speech becomes toxic, or we might more accurately say, of hearing ourselves. Don't we occasionally say in moments of deep and stressful disagreement with somebody, just listen to yourself? Don't we frequently need that said to ourselves? Perhaps it's something that every preacher ought to have written out and glued to the edge of the pulpit. Just listen to yourself. So here are a few thoughts about some of the roots of pathology and distortion here. The first is a very obvious one. We can use language to mark our boundaries. We can use it to signal existing and limited solidarities. That's to say, to mark insiders out from outsiders. One of the things which is particularly evident in class-ridden societies, like that of the United Kingdom, is the very subtle markers in speech and behavior that let you know whether somebody is inside or outside a particular social background. But I don't think it's just a problem in the United Kingdom. In one way or another, we, and notably we as religious believers, have tribal signals. We put up semi-visible and semi-audible flags for one another, as if to reassure the person we're speaking to, I'm one of you. We put up more flags to signal to somebody else to say, don't worry, they're all right. I'm all right, you're all right. We share a language, we share a world, and our speech helps us to reinforce that sense of belonging together. And of course, that also means that when we hear certain kinds of word, accent, idiom, intonation, we know somebody does not belong. And one of those texts of terror which Patricia was talking about earlier on is, of course, the famous story of the fate of the Ephraimites in Judges, when, having failed to join in the campaign of the rest of Israel against its enemies, they are tracked down and identified by the fact that they cannot pronounce the consonant SH. They can't say shibboleth. It's given us one of the most durable words in our own language for those little markers by which we identify insiders and outsiders. Speech is used to mark boundaries, to signal tribal solidarity. Rather than being a process in which we allow ourselves to be changed or enlarged, challenged or shifted, our speech becomes a carefully calculated exchange of received signals and received wisdom. I will say this, and I know what you will say. You will say that, and you know what I will say. And we're safe. The dangerous world of human encounter is tamed and domesticated when we're able to recognize one another in this way. and we lose the sense that we might together be journeying towards a world that is strange to all of us and new to all of us. I begin with this obvious example, partly because in some ways it doesn't look all that problematic. Of course we have these little markers. Of course it's reassuring to find that someone else's experience and reality chimes with mine and I can relax. I have a vivid memory of a dinner in the University College of Swansea many years ago, where I find myself sitting on a table where most of the other people around the table were first language Welsh speakers. My own knowledge of the Welsh language is reasonable, but not brilliantly fluent. I started rather nervously talking to my neighbour, and half a sentence in, heard her use a particular idiom. And I said to her, "Where in the Swansea Valley do you come from?" And she had, of course, grown up in a village about 10 miles from mine. I relaxed with a great out-breath. The evening was not going to be quite such hard work as I thought, because her Welsh was as corrupt, dialect-ridden, and inaccurate as mine. At that level, you may say harmless enough. But let's not forget the Ephraimites. Let's not forget the ways in which our systems of human power readily co-opt these markers and signals of tribal identity and deploy them, as I said last night, weaponize them against the outsider. And let's not forget that, cozy as it is to find you're speaking the same dialect as somebody else, the language of Zion is neither your dialect nor mine, but something which takes us beyond all that. Not cancelling, but moving it on. I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, of course, the tribal marker syndrome is one which also shows itself in the stories we tell about ourselves. And the second form of speech which can trigger violence has to do with those stories we tell which freeze the past, freeze the identity we look back to, hold us in an identity of hostility or rivalry or victimhood or whatever. Hold us in a myth of our historical innocence or our historical victory. Wales again. We tell lots of stories about our history, and they're mostly about our status as victims in relation to the English. We were robbed of our land in the 6th century by the English, who, interestingly enough, presented themselves, once they were Christians, in the light of the Israelites moving into Canaan, which meant that we British were cast in the role of pagan Canaanites. Well, you may say, fair enough, but the problem is that a story of privation, of violence endured, is always on the edge of becoming a story of innocence. And the outrageous thing about historical violence is not that it's violence by the intrinsically evil against the intrinsically innocent, but just that it's violence. It's not, so to speak, bad because the Welsh were innocent and the English weren't. It's bad because that kind of conflict is intrinsically evil. And however innocent or guilty the Welsh were is neither here nor there. The Venerable Bede, in his History of the English People, goes out of his way to show that the Welsh deserved all they got from the English on account of being heretics. But that doesn't really help very much, does it? The problem isn't guilt or innocence. The problem is the bare fact of aggression. But we tell those stories that freeze, that absolve, that keep us tied to a particular kind of identity. And because that can sometimes lead us to fantasies of revenge and reversal, that kind of speech becomes another seed. Nothing we do to anyone else could be as bad as what was done to us is a form of this. And I've come across it in a number of contexts, not least in the Balkans, that cockpit of apparently ceaseless ethnic violence and resentment. And having said that one of the pathologies of speech is this freezing of our history, the next thing to go on to and to reflect on is, of course, that such an approach to speech blocks us off from looking at our past as a story of how we have learned. We can speak in such a way that the question is never raised of how we got to speak like this. How did we learn? What changed us? What drew us on? What drew us forward? As if our speech, our identity, fell from heaven and stuck, as if we'd never learned anything. And here's one of the great paradoxes of the modern age, is it not? In the 18th century and after, Europe, on the whole, fell in love with a new myth. Having got, at various levels, bored and annoyed with the Christian myth, it settled on a new worldview, equally mythical. The view that there was a universal, rational account of the universe and the human, which had been given to Europe, and which was so self-evidently true that it could happily and confidently be exported to and imposed upon absolutely anyone and anything else, anywhere. Which is, in a nutshell, the history of the last couple of centuries. Because nobody much bothered to ask, how did we ever learn to be enlightened? Where did this complex new mythology come from? And the strange thing is that all those 18th century rationalists seem to have believed, in effect, that this fell from heaven. So obvious, it doesn't need to be argued for. And in a whole range of forms, it's still with us, isn't it? Whether it's in the intrinsically racist assumptions that still control so much of our national and international politics, whether it's in our attitude to and response to indigenous peoples the world over, as we were reminded by Terry so wonderfully this morning, whether it's in the assumption that something called the scientific worldview has invalidated any and every supplementary or alternative or parallel view of reality, it's still very potent. And the power of the self-evident is a great power indeed. I don't really need to argue this with you, because any reasonable person knows I'm right. And if you don't know that I'm right, you're clearly not a reasonable person, and we'd better terminate this conversation, and I'll find some other way of imposing my view on you. So the refusal to learn how we got where we are is the third form of pathology around our speech. That assumption of self-evident rightness. Whereas we know, we learn how to speak by trial and error. We learn what the world is like in any number of different ways, some of them scientific, some of them not. And the deepest cost to us in adopting that self-evident worldview is surely the cost that comes by turning our backs on those long long-learned, deep-rooted ways of being in the world that are not those of post-18th century Europe. And I don't think I need to underline what all that entails. Now, I used just then the example of that moment in argument where you say, if you can't see that I'm right, you can't be a reasonable person. And so my next form of linguistic disease, violence breeding language, is that kind of speech which systematically extracts aggression, darkness, and ambivalence from here and locates it there. A speech for which the ultimate marker is not just familiarity and unfamiliarity, or even innocence and guilt, or even rationality and irrationality, but essentially a marker which says light and darkness. What makes for violence, what makes for instability, is always out there. I can't remember who it was who first noted a very salient feature in the rhetoric, again, of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s. I believe it may be a passage in Thomas Merton that first alerted me to this. Hitler was in the habit of speaking in the late 30s about how international Jewish conspiracy was pushing him to adopt certain measures against the Jews, and therefore pushing the world towards conflagration and conflict. It's really a version of, look what you've made me do, as if Hitler, confronted with Auschwitz, turns to the world at large and says, look what you made me do. I am innocent, but out there, in the Jewish people, in the international world order, are all those aggressive, destructive forces which are making me do what I would never do left to myself, because I am by definition innocent. Where I live is natural and obvious and peaceful, and where the rest of you live is hell. And your hellish destructiveness and greed are pushing in on me and making me do these dreadful things. Heard that one somewhere? Heard it perhaps in your own encounters at times? I hear it in myself. And as somebody who exercised responsibility in an ecclesiastical institution, I find it very uncomfortable to recognize just a little bit of an echo in my own experience, my own temptation when faced with a difficult decision to say, look what you've made me do. But the main thing is that mysterious dynamism of displacement. Out there is the dark, and here is the light. Where I am is the natural place, the good place, the innocent place. In here is goodwill. In here is the self-evident righteousness and light that belongs to a natural human being. And if you can't see that I'm right, not only are you not a reasonable human being, you're probably not a human being at all. And from then on, all sorts of very promising avenues start opening up. So far, what I've been sketching is a kind of cumulative assortment of pathologies leading us towards that fatal moment of dehumanizing, when our speech not only constructs strangers, or guilty strangers, or stupid and unreasonable strangers, but aliens, people with whom I do not belong at all. And it hardly needs me to underline the way in which, globally at the moment, political rhetoric driving more and more towards the total alienation and demonizing of opponents whether that rhetoric comes from one end of the spectrum or the other, that is having a really serious and death-dealing effect on our capacity to live as properly plural, argumentative, but trustful societies. But there's a more subtle and pervasive, slightly less obvious way in which speech becomes pathological in the way I've outlined. And that's quite simply the speech that ignores the speech of the other. Speech that doesn't respond and doesn't ask for responses. I don't know if any of you know a lecture given some years ago by the late, great Ursula Le Guin on the mother tongue. A lecture in which she discusses the different kinds of rhetoric that human beings use, which she identifies as the father tongue and the mother tongue. The father tongue, in her typology, is the kind of talking that does not wait for an answer. It analyzes, describes, commands, or whatever, but what it doesn't do is invite. I suspect that Ursula Le Guin in her later life might have shrunk back just a little bit from the heavy gender stereotyping that underlies her analysis. Yet, I'm not so sure. There's a point there certainly to reflect on. But as soon as I read that many years back, I remember realizing that there was indeed a deep and serious cleavage in the styles and registers of language we use, depending on whether we were expecting an answer or not. And the language of simple description, simple command, and so on, the language, once again, of the self-evidently rational Western male, that is not language which expects response. And therefore, in not waiting for or inviting response, and not itself being open to the response that comes through invitation, it becomes, once again, a pathology and a source of potential violence, because its effect is to silence the non-standard speaker, the speaker of the mother tongue, who is interested in response and invitation, and perhaps willing to take a bit more time over description and command. The church is historically, of course, pretty good at whatever the opposite is of the mother tongue. You'll all know that the church has been described as an organization devoted to providing flawless answers to questions that nobody is actually asking. And once again, I dare say that we are familiar enough with the ways in which our own eagerness to answer a question makes us incapable of hearing the question actually being asked. Because our language doesn't really invite and doesn't really respond. That, because it's a little bit more elusive than some of the other varieties of the seeds of violence I've been describing, that perhaps is one which we ought to be particularly alert to in our own age. But what I've done really is just to offer a few possible perspectives on the kinds of language that can sow seeds of violence, that put out there into the generative soil possibilities of distancing and breaking, of silencing and annihilating what speech is meant in God's purpose to create and consolidate. But I do need to put in a word of caution here. I've been speaking about kinds of language which are attended with deep and serious risk. And the temptation then can be for us to say, well, given all these risks, surely the priority in our speech must be to avoid anything that could produce confrontation, disagreement, or conflict. In other words, the answer to all of this, the answer to the challenge in the letter of James, is be nice. Now, that can't be quite right, not least because the Word incarnate in the Gospels, whatever else one might say about our Lord, does not appear to be nice. Jesus is compassionate, passionate, a source of unimaginable welcome, healing, and restoration, the embodiment of a love that will recreate without asking questions and give without reserve. But nice isn't quite the word. And if you happened to be a religious expert on the wrong end of Jesus' tongue, nice would not be the word you'd choose. So we do need to be aware that this particular kind of typology of how things can go wrong is not an alibi for blandness. So it doesn't mean that our speech should never confront or challenge. Sometimes, and again I pick up on themes that Patricia was outlining, sometimes our speech must be sharply focused to deny the denials of another. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in 1935, famously or infamously, said that anybody who separates from the confessing church in Germany separates from salvation. And our nice response would be how very intolerant of him. But of course what Bonhoeffer was saying was, if you are prepared to accept the nakedly racial assumptions of the state church, the Deutsche Christen, in Germany at that point, if you're willing to accept that and believe that is Christian, frankly, I have nothing more to say to you. I don't know how to speak to you now. And if that's your decision, you are removing yourself from a conversation. And my task is to warn you about that. Not to close down the doors prematurely, and he says that very clearly, but to say to you, for God's sake, don't close the door, because your allegiance to the state church is closing a door on Christ. Strong words, but I don't think wholly inconsistent with what I've been saying, because what Bonhoeffer believes he is doing is denying the denial, resisting the refusal of grace. Likewise, to speak of the dangers of a language that marks boundaries or freezes the past is not in any sense at all to say that we have no business telling our story, let alone that we have no business telling our stories of injury or offense, of marginalization. On the contrary, once again, if such stories are suppressed and silenced by others, that is itself an offense. The person who finds the courage to come and speak of what was done to them so that things may change is a person who needs all the support and all the admiration we can give. Whether it's the person who has lived through abuse as a child, whether it's a woman who has spoken out about harassment and exploitation, whether it's the suppressed subaltern culture finding its voice to name for the dominant culture the offenses and injuries that have been done. It's not about that. It's about the risk, the danger of simply learning to speak about one's own injury in a way that makes change or healing less possible. But more importantly, It's a warning about the way in which the powerful are often remarkably able to seize the language of victimhood and use it for their own protection and security. C.S. Lewis's famous remark about his experience in an English public school at the beginning of the last century comes to mind. He says that rampant bullying and exploitation of younger boys by older in the school was often connived at by the school authorities on the grounds that you couldn't leave the younger boys undisciplined, otherwise they'd be so dangerous to the older ones. And Lewis says it's a very interesting perspective that the frail and trembling wolves have to be protected from the ravening sheep. But the way in which categories, classes, persons reach for that language to protect themselves, so that we are encouraged to think, for example, these days, that the real cultural risk is to men, well, we can reflect with profit on the dynamics behind that, I think. So I'm not saying that there is no place for speaking out and naming one's pain, one's privation, one's disadvantage. All those medieval Welsh poems about the terrible things the English did perhaps have their place after all. But a place within a relationship that doesn't stop there, which makes a bid, a proper bid, to be heard. And there's all the difference in the world, literally, between speech that makes a bid to be heard and speech that makes a bid to silence. I and people like me have suffered, have been pushed aside. Hear me. Oh, well, I and people like me have suffered also, so shut up. Ends of a spectrum, and we need to know the difference. Sometimes these days we're not very good at telling the difference. Again, thinking about the way in which we project onto others our aggression and all the rest of it, I'm not saying that we should therefore spend all our time analyzing the complexities of our own insides and relativizing all judgment we make in our relations with others. Evil isn't just to be psychologized and internalized, otherwise we're back with the previous problem. Yes, I've done something evil or aggressive, but look what you made me do. It's not about me or my agency or my thinking. And if I appeal to the need to hear honestly and courageously what another says, to invite what another wants to say to me, to respond to that, that again is different from saying that what I say or what I am is to be dictated by the other. No. I need to find my voice and invite another to hear it as it is, and be ready to do exactly the same in return. Well, I could go on about these, what I've called pathologies of speech, and also about the ways in which we are tempted to oversimplify them and reach for blandness instead of peace. But you will, I think, see where I'm driving at this afternoon. Peace is, again, as I was hinting in last night's sermon, peace is a state of active interchange. Peace is a condition where you might say we need more courage than war. Because peace, lasting peace, is a state when we are confident enough, trustful enough to speak and to be heard. And that's a big step in our culture. And if we as churches claim to be communities where the peace of God, which passes all understanding, is at work, then part of what we're called to do is to model speech of that kind, to nourish in ourselves and in one another that courage and confidence and trust, which doesn't seek to silence voices, which doesn't seek to project everything that's evil beyond the church, which doesn't retreat into the tribalism that the church is so in love with, making its little Masonic signals to each other all the time about insiders and outsiders. No, the church is called to be a place where the Logos of God is truly visible and audible. That Logos in which and out of which every being, human and otherwise, has its, well, we'd say rationale, using a Latinized version of what the Logos is all about. Its structure, its place in an interlocking system. We're a place where the Logos is at work, the Logos of connectedness, attunement, to use an image I really love because I like music, the Logos which allows us to invite and to listen and to rejoice in the difference of what we hear from what we say. And so preaching in that connection is, as it always is, I suspect, the summons to the church to be itself, to be that community of Logos. But if preaching is to do that work, the preacher needs to have some kind of rule of thumb about the kinds of speech that go corrupt and corrosive. Did those words of mine send out whoever and whatever it might be? What has what I said made possible? Most of us, thank God, don't have much chance of starting revolutions. Most of us in this church, I dare say, would probably not be in Rob Schenk's agonizing position of asking, did I make somebody's murder possible? Most of us are dealing with what may seem more prosaic instances of loss or failure or misunderstanding. And yet to have in our minds and hearts something of a checklist about the kinds of speech that close down, exclude, and disempower doesn't do us any harm. And what I hope is that tomorrow, reflecting a bit more on the seeds of communion, we can turn this slightly somber perspective, which both Patricia's presentation and mine have, I know, been, into something a little more affirmative about what speech looks like and sounds like when it is actually doing its God-given job, and when the radiance of the Logos does indeed become the underlying reality of all we say and all we see in and out of the church. Thank you very much.